So, the person that you have come to see this morning is Dick Richardson. So, Dick is internationally recognised, and I guess you all know that, and that's why you're here. He's a leader in the practice of natural grazing to improve soil depth, water retention, increase biodiversity, and animal production. He's actually our international man of mystery today, hails from South Africa, and he tells me his name isn't Richard, and that his first language was Zulu. So there's some interesting conversation over your cup of tea later. His presentation will be really fact-filled, informative and challenging because his methodology actually challenges some of the traditional best practice that we know from other people. He said one of his key points today will be relating to how to improve productivity and create ecosystems that remain rain-ready in the dry times. So it sounds like a pretty good time to be hearing some of that. He's going to be drawing amazing things on the whiteboard, which will be shown up here. And I'd like to hand over to him. Dick, come on down.
Thank you. It is on. Super. Thanks, Wendy. I must just try and stay relatively still so I don't moor off this high table thing today. Thank you for having me, everybody. Wendy, thank you for the introduction, and Reef Catchments for organising me to be here. So I thought, when Wendy wanted to know something specific about me before the thing, so I said, I'm really known as the long black Dick. She refused to use that, but anyway, so we were in the Townsville airport one morning with Graham Rees. Some of you might know Graham. He ordered me a coffee. He ordered a long black. I was at the loo. I got back there, waiting in front of the little cafe thing there, and this poor chick walks out with this coffee and yells at the top of her voice, "Long black Dick," she yelled. So the whole place gets a snigger, just like you rude bastards. I mean, that's my name. I didn't choose the freaking thing. Anyway, so I walk up there to go and get my coffee, and of course I couldn't resist today. I gave this huge stage whisper, "Thank God they didn't call me. Thank God I didn't order a flat white," I said. So, yeah, can you imagine that? Top of the voice. That wouldn't have worked very well. Righto, so today there's two sessions with me. The first of the two sessions is going to be a little bit of background history. I know in the modern day world, history is sort of banned as a subject, but I sort of figure that if you want to know anything about where to go next or what to do, what systems to run, you need to look a little bit in history, right? Because history will tell you a bit of the stories. And then if we work from there, we can then look forward. So the second session, I'll get into a little bit of the practical about how to do it. If you want to know a bit about my background, just have a read there rather than me waste time telling you what I've done. Okay, first and foremost, I want to start with a statement. I might actually write it on the back of this board to give me more room, and that'll make me hop around a little bit more. Got some lovely big writing tools here. I don't speak French, so I'm a bit buggered with what's written there. I did have relatives that did, obviously, once upon a time. One of them ended up as a slave in the US, which is quite interesting. So one of the statements that you guys would recognise is the statement that nature... I've got to get used to this big pen. I haven't used a really big one since junior school. Works in patterns and wholes. And this was written by a fellow called Jan Smuts, famous South African who became a field marshal, fought against the British in the Boer Wars and ended up fighting for the British in the First World War, became a field marshal. And this statement was the one key statement, if you like, that brought holism back into the modern day world from Greek philosophy time. And it's emphasized very well and strongly by Savory in the holistic management process, whom I used to train educators for. But for some reason, what the word is that these guys have hung up on is this word wholes. There's no doubt humans need a more holistic perspective when they do things, but every one of you buggers here is a tinkerer. Even the woman who can do 5 or 10 things at the same time, you're also essentially tinkering with all of those different things. It's one of the things we really battle to do. And nobody's going to argue that we want a more holistic perspective. However, to me, the one word that had no emphasis put on it, which is the key statement here, is that patterns drive the holes. Oh, by the way, if I put too many T's in there or spell something wrong today, that's not my fucking problem. I can't spell. You spell it right in your notes, okay? So patterns drive holes. This is a key and really important thing, because if you want to change a hole, what have you got to change? You've got to change the pattern. And yet nearly all regenerative agricultural practices today have very set patterns and styles about them. The grazing management that we're being mistaught is the ultimate of regenerative grazing. Nearly all of those are rotational grazing, which means all the paddocks get rotated around every time. Great big patterns, and after a big change, but this is one of the things Dick is pretty famous for, is this little statement here. This is my little statement of this. Once upon a time, I was known to say that change equals change, right? So if you've got a scenario where you set stocking, for example, and you change to rotational grazing, so you're changing the pattern of use, is there going to be a responding change in nature? It's a guarantee. There's no choice. It has to, because the patterns that are driving that whole are now being changed. So if you throw a massive change into a landscape, for example, go to rotational grazing from set stocking, where granddad's bullocks, 200 going in there every March, is being carried out still by the grandson today. That's a pretty simple system. You go and put some kind of rotation, move stock around, just put cows in there. That's such a shock to that country. The urine coming out next to the dung, for example, that's more moisture closer to the dung pad. That's going to be a totally different outcome for the biology and the dung beetles in that particular paddock. Big change equals big change, right? And then, of course, most people get that from Dick and get all excited and run around, so they make no change. And what does no change equal? No, it's all wrong. Hopefully today you'll learn that it doesn't create no change. No change creates entropy, which ends up in a loss of energy. You lose biological practice, you lose diversity, it'll simplify. At any stage that there's no change in pattern, it'll simplify. Right, so Jan Smuts, Dick Richardson, and then this other statement I'm going to put up here is ancient, I'm sure. I first came across it in the writings of the Lassiter brothers, who were the guys that made that Beefmaster breed of cattle. You would have come across them, I'm sure. It was really good reading. We learned a lot about all that sort of stuff. But the sentence was that form follows function. Now, you put this together with nature works in patterns and wholes, it's an underlining of exactly that same thing. The form of your ecosystem will always follow the functions and functioning of that ecosystem. And this is one of the failings, again, in human nature. Generally, as humans, we try and set a goal, we define what that goal must look like, and we then spend the rest of our lives fighting with every freaking thing that comes our way to try and make a specific outcome come out. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a bit like pushing stuff uphill, a bit like a dung beetle does, right? Sorry, the male dung beetle does, while the female stands on the ball and says, this way, that way, quicker, slower, mind out of the car, right? All that shit. Dick, I'm steering, all right? Don't think of me now as being bad news for telling you those stories. Right, so form follows the function. So what we need to concentrate on is function rather than form, and let form define itself, which is why from here on in, I'll drop back to principles that we can see in nature and in ecosystems to try and identify how ecosystems work, rather than you dealing with your ecosystem with a predetermined outcome of what you believe that ecosystem should have and how it should operate, and spend the rest of your life pushing shit uphill trying to make things happen. Okay. Righto, we've got question time later, so please just write them down there. You can make little airplanes out of them and send them to Wendy, or you can just write them down and ask them later. I don't know really what the protocol is. In my hand here, I've got a little thing. I don't know if anybody can see what that little thing is. Any guesses? I picked it up, it had fallen out of the concrete over there. It is a? It's a rock, all right? A little stone in this case, a smaller rock. This is a rock. So this thing is a pretty solid object. I'll throw it at anyone who goes to sleep. Pretty solid object in our view, but if you have a look at it, there's a lovely movie you can look at the space inside rocks. If this has a particle in it the size of this building, if you got close enough to see it and make it the size of this building, the next closest particle in it would be something like 4 k's away and be half the size of this building. That's how much space there is inside this thing. And if you broke this open, you'd find bacteria in here already eating this rock. As the poor buggers in Gangster's Paradise, I'm sure some of you have heard of Gangster's Paradise, Johannesburg Airport's 2,000 metres above sea level. The poor buggers are digging at 4,000 metres below soil surface, so they're 2,000 metres below ocean, whatever it's called, sea level, from the top of the Halfveld there. And the rocks they dig out from down there are full of bacteria eating the rocks to break them down. So the process of this thing being separated into particles that eventually end up as soil has begun at that point. But from there, it's a hell of a long way to working out eventually to become soil. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is just draw a bit of a picture on that. If I take this and a whole bunch of mates of it, and I put them in a bucket of water overnight, and in the morning I scoop them out of there with a colander, the little sieve chappy from the kitchen. I'll clean them all out of there. How much water is going to come out on these? It's a very small percentage of what's in the bucket. Does everyone agree? So it's got a low water holding capacity. So I'll put them down here on a piece of tarp there, and I'll put them down. Within a few minutes, they dry. Yep. So the water holding capacity, the water catching ability is near zero. The water holding capacity is zero, or very near to zero. Everyone happy? We've got a healthy soil? So, has anybody ever been to Joburg? It's a pretty rough old joint, right? So you go and park your car at the supermarket and you get out and there'll be a mate in camo gear with a pump action shotgun come over and say, look after your car. And you've got to say yes, otherwise there's problems. Then you head off into the shop and you come out with your gear and you get back in. And this particular shopping centre I went to that day had a strip joint between the doctor's door and the shopping place. And while I was about to pay the bloke $5 and sort my thing out, these 3 suits came stumbling out of the strip joint. They'd been in there for lunch, obviously. And the 2 of them were dragging the bloke in the middle out of there. And he just kept saying, no, I want to go back. She loves me. And I said, no, mate, she doesn't love you. She does that to everybody. She smiles to everybody. Come on. And they drag him. He ran away 3 or 4 times. They caught him. Eventually, one had him up against the car while the other bloke paid the chap with the shotgun, and they sort of locked him in the car almost, right, with the child lock and the whole 9 yards. Anyway, just as he was getting into the car, he said, well, I suppose she loves me. She just doesn't know it yet, right? Soil just doesn't know it yet, right? So this is on its way to become soil. It was a long old process, and I'm going to short circuit it for you today. For a lot of you will think, well, what the hell are we going to know about all this for? Just grin and bear it. Look, if you don't like it, you don't like the things I say, there's a big door that side and one that side. You're welcome to help yourself to them. They're not going anywhere, right? So what happened over time, oh my goodness. There we go. Right. So we've got history over time. We went from no space, very little air in the old soil. I'll write air up here for you. Just a tiny little word. There's not much space in there, not much air. As we said, the water stays in the bucket. It doesn't come out. Over time, soils have evolved to the soils we know today. Best soils we know of in the world are the ones, say, under the prairies of the US, 100 to 200 feet down of beautiful honeycombed soil that if we dig them out and we put them in a bucket overnight, I'm not talking about the one under the maize plant, or what do you guys call them here, the mealie plant, whatever. or not a corn, I think it's called here. If you go and dig it out under a grass plant in that prairie at the time of Beale walking across there, who said he was the first bloke to walk across east to west of the US. He was the first white fella pushing other buggers out of the way. He'd probably done it 100 times. But anyway, he's dug this hole, and it's got some leaves of grasses and things on top of it. He digs it out, and he puts that in a bucket overnight. And he leaves it in the bucket overnight, and he pulls it out in the morning and grabs it by the grass, lifts it out of that bucket. It takes all the water with it, stays intrinsically together. The soil at this point over here is capable of holding itself together. So those are supposed to be two arrows pointing towards each other, holds itself together so that it doesn't fall apart when it's got all that water in it. It's got, by now, just this much soil has got nearly 20 inches of water it's drawn up inside it, but it then also holds itself apart. Does that make sense? So it's got this intrinsic ability to hold itself apart and together. The space in here is the thing that sets it apart from this rock at the other end of the picture. Whoop, that came off nice and easy. So the secret to this thing is that this process right. Never mind. Space. We'll just write in blue and black today. Space is the thing that's developed for this going that way. Okay? So it's holding itself together and holding itself apart, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I define as a healthy soil. You put it in a bucket, you leave it in the bucket overnight, it soaks the water up out of the bucket, it only leaves a teensy-weensy bit of silt in there, probably because we buggered it up with a spade as we pushed the spade in and we broke some of it off at the bottom when we dug it sideways. Is there anybody who would disagree in here that that is a healthy soil? For all the things that I say that upset the apple cart and the people around the earth, the thing that it keeps people bringing me back to the reef country is that I know that this happened in ecological past, and I, by looking back in history, know how to repeat this process, that we can build a soil that captures its rainfall, holds it there to give back over time to the plants that are there, and holds the soil together that it's raining on. Does that make sense? That's why we stop reef getting more and more silt. That's how we catch more rain where it falls, and that's how we produce more feed and therefore can carry more livestock. That's the principle. I could probably give up my talk now and we could just go into question time, but I want to share a little bit of the principles that made that happen. So I didn't get any disagreement, how's that for a word, on that statement that that's what a healthy soil is. Cool. So look, historically, and I've got a bit of a green here, but you buggers can't see it anyway. So I'll just draw black and blue and have fun. The oldest original plant that had phytotoxin, or organism that had plankton, Dick, hang on. The one that originally was able to start doing photosynthesis, okay, thank you, is a plant or an organism. It's not really a plant, it's a precursor to plant. It's called lichen. Okay, and on this, a little bit of a photosynthetic cell. From before that, you had your algae and your slimes and all these other people. You had this little lichen here, which was able to catch solar energy. This little person teamed up with something called a fungi. This fungi used acid to deconstruct mineral and nutrient and make space out of a little piece of stone out of the rock over here. And this one fixed the carbon out of the atmosphere to feed the two together. And wow, after the algae and the slimes, etc., this was the beginning of a partnership between plants or photosynthetic organisms and fungi that built the ability to cycle carbon. Carbon cycling is what it's all about. I know somebody was giving a talk in Sydney and they were talking about a carbon cycle, and old mate thought it was some kind of modern bicycle made out of carbon fibers. But it's not. It's the cycling of that carbon. It's going to be captured here somehow. It's got to come back out. This was the beginning of that. These lichens evolved a little bit further. They became mosses, etc. But eventually the first plants were born. Okay, the first plants that were born came out of the ground with 2 leaves, dicotyledonous things. They turned into trees. Okay, these were trees. A tree made a heavy lignin type of plant material. Lignin was the main thing it was producing. We'll write lignin up here. This picture will end up pretty untidy, but we built it together, so it's as much your problem as it is mine. Has a root system maybe that'll hold it up underneath, also heavy in lignin. But all the fine roots that exist under this tree will be right up at soil surface, so that the more cellulose and lignin dropping material off the outside of the tree, the only live part of the tree after 7 years is on the outside of the tree. That's where the soft bit sits. Okay, that drops it down. And guess who did the work in the ground there? Its mates, the fungi, who'd now evolved a little bit further. They are all in the saprotroph family of fungi. They're the ones who do the decomposition here. So they use acids. They excrete that acid, and they then ingest the material. And this is pretty critical because carbon, as we said, it's got a cycle for life to occur. Carbon is the most limiting factor to how much feed we can produce on Earth at the moment. It is very, very, very much in short supply. 0.0416% of the atmosphere is carbon, massively in short supply. So our food production is limited by how much carbon we have in the atmosphere. Carbon levels, most of you would want to know those. I'm sort of jumping ahead here. But in 1944, that was 0.44%. So it's actually driven down since 1940. And the lowest point was 0.0298, I think, just below 3, or 289 maybe, but just below 3, just south of 3. And that was in 1980 something, right? The lowest point in more recent history is back in 1860-ish, which was at 0.02 something, which is why we were having such a tough time in England. All our people were getting hungry. Your forefathers were becoming thieves and were getting put in chains to be sent over here because there was hunger and starvation because of a lack of production in the northern regions, okay? So anyway, that's part of that history. So carbon's got a cycle one way or another. What we tend to know around the world then as decomposition, I don't like using that to cover it all over, but you have had composition through plants. In other words, Tchaikovsky wrote for hours and made this beautiful music, okay? That's all written in little dots and dashes on paper. You give that to Dick, and it doesn't matter what piece of musical instrument I pick up, I guarantee you I will deconstruct it into something ugly and little sounds. So the deconstruction of carbon-based compounds is what needs to occur to put that back up at the top. Deconstruction is going to occur in the old days almost entirely through decomposition. Okay, this is done external to the organism. Even the single-cell organisms that do it tend to have smooth cell walls. They release acids to do the decomposition. They then imbibe via like an osmosis process. They get that bit of nutrient into them. That's decomposition. These acid operation fungi, these saprotrophs, they're very visible. You'd see them through the country. They look like big spiders' webs. They're visible, go through the country, smells fungal, etc. That breaks that down at soil surface using the acids. These get some of the nutrient. The tree, with all its fine root system, sits there, gathers that nutrient, and then the nutrients available to the tree. The circle continues. Okay? That's the decomposition process. That's the carbon cycling. Was there an animal kingdom present? Have any of you ever sat down to a meal of tree? I think you've all eaten fruit and nuts and shit off trees, or some of you had, but some of that is like a really higher order tree, a more modern tree scenario, okay, these old ones. Even I'm led to believe that even in the hungriest parts of the world, poverty-struck parts of the world, people still haven't been able to eat tree. Okay, because we can't digest trees. Even that lovely soft balsa wood from the east, it just goes straight through. Okay, can't turn it into dung and urine, you just turn it into misshapen wood. Okay, so were there any animals in this ecosystem? Yes, they began to evolve in that point. The animal kingdom at this point, because of a very high amount of carbon being turned over through these guys, was a very small ecosystem, and you can see I've written them very small at this end. All the animals in this ecosystem at this point in time also use acids to break down plant material outside of their bodies. So they're also ectophytes is the correct word for it, outside of plants. They break down that plant material and then ingest it. A couple of examples which still exist today, things like white ants, witchetty grubs. You can't eat wood. Those poor bastards have to work up a spit. They have to drink a few beers and get all slobbery. Then they can slobber it out there, and that breaks down that lignin, and then they can ingest it. And yes, it eventually gets turned into dung and urine. But the point being that this decomposition pathway nearly inevitably always ends up with inert plant material. In other words, the pluses and minuses, the charges on the elements, are not free and easy, able to be picked up. They're tied up into something else, okay? And what you guys where you'd be able to find this material today is at where I went for breakfast this morning. What's that shop called? Like Bunnings or the big blue one, that home improvement joint. They had plants there near the might have 10 or someone like that. I bet you can get potting soil there. Potting soil is the closest thing to this particular kind of soil, and it is basically just detritus. It's freshly composted or whatever. It hasn't even been finished. There it is in potting soil. Ideal conditions for germination of all those woody species. Okay, so now let's get a spadeful of forest soil or woodland soil that we dig out there and we put it in the bucket overnight. These fine roots with all the plant detritus sitting up at the top here, that's easy, that's loose. We can probably spoon it in. That old thing, you've got to be able to get your hands in it if it's a healthy soil. Well, yes, you will be able to. You've got to spoon it off the top. Then this little bit has roots that you will dig, and then underneath that is likely to be an airless clay. Okay, all the air sitting up on top here. You put this in the bucket overnight, you come back in the morning, and it's got a wad like this of floating detritus on top, and all the soil underneath is just slaked away and fallen down to the bottom of the bucket. That is pre-soil. That is woodland detritus. It is not soil, by the definition I give to soil. Okay? What would the carbon content of that be? Well, if you're going to take it and burn it, which is what you're supposed to do to measure carbon, that'll burn. And it'll have a shitload of carbon in it, right? But if you sent it off for a soil test, how much carbon would there be in it? Well, hello, baby, because it says on the carbon test thing you've got to take all the plant material out, isn't it? In fact, they put a little sieve there, 30 micron, someone here would know the exact numbers. But anyway, it's a very, very small micron sieve that removes all the plant material. So the carbon content of that is probably pretty bloody low if you did it with modern day equipment. Right, so somebody says, what about green? Like, you can see green. I'll draw you a couple of green leaves on this tree. You can see them, beautiful green leaves. Okay, there's green present. So this construction of plant material isn't just carbohydrates, in this case lignin. So carbon, 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 hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. I'll draw you a really simple one. These are little H's. And at one end, oxygen, carbohydrate. There's hundreds of different versions of it, some in circles, some in helixes, etc., but that's a carbohydrate. So if there's a green leaf present, there's something else that needs to be on that picture. What's that? Nah, bugger magnesium. It's nitrogen, eh? Okay, magnesium is a cool idea. It fits somewhere in the cell thing. We can talk about that later if you want. But nitrogen is the big deal. That is what makes a carbohydrate into a protein. If it's got a green leaf, it's got a nitrogen stuck on there. So what I've drawn for you here is a carbon cycle. Where's the nitrogen cycle in my picture? So Dick hasn't put it on there yet, has he? So how does nitrogen cycle in these ecosystems? Who did the cycling of nitrogen? Who still does it today? Any questions? Ideas? The bacterial community, right? Bacterial community, the ones that operate the nitrogen. In these low air, highly acidic scenarios, it was an alien place for a bacteria to live. So the bacteria were all absolutely endophytic. In other words, they live inside the root system. They have these little nodules that fit inside the root. It is too dangerous for them to be out of that. In fact, we've got to be thankful to only one family of bacteria that managed to work out how to do this, and that is the Rhizobium family. Okay, there's only one. The whole of life on Earth is reliant on this one family who got going and worked out this little trick. To make this work under these conditions, the plant had to once again release acids. This is a bit of a weaker acid than these ones from here. It's a carbonic acid, to be able to open the soil up a little bit, to let a little bit of air in around these guys, because the nitrogen comes out of the air that they're going to fix. Okay? How much nitrogen is in the air? Any ideas? Say again? 78%. There you go. 100%. Nitrogen, 78% of the atmosphere. Free and easy as ever. As Viraj is telling us there, it's the one that you do not have to ever buy, because in a woodland scenario, these buggers just do it, and they've been doing it forever, no problem at all. That's where the nitrogen came from. So protein was then seen too. How am I going time-wise, Wens? Good. 20 minutes, oh, not that good. Right. Then we've got little shrubs that came after trees. They operated the same way as the trees. Shrubs, just a small tree, same thing. But then, I don't know what the hell happens with evolution, but somehow something is knickers in a knot and bang, you've got something works a different way. This was the evolution into a higher order plant. This term, lower order, ancient, higher order, modern. Higher order, but still come out of the ground as a little baby with 2 leaves, so still a dicot, but the inside out of a tree. These were the first time we had plants that had now all sorts of different leaf structures, like big broad leaves. For the first time we had tubers. For the first time we had fibrous rooted plants evolve. There was a big evolutionary step here, but the difference between them and trees is that all the soft pulp that carries the nutrients on the inside and the lignin is on the outside that holds it up. These things are called forbs in the language that I come from. You bastards get talked so much shit to you call them weeds, I think, nearly across the board, but they are forbs. Anybody ever eaten a forb in this room? Any plant that you've eaten straight was a forb, okay? Because you can digest that. Instead of lignin, this is now in a new realm, which is very high in cellulose, and the beginning to increase the Brix levels, the sugar levels of what's there, and the digestibility began to take off. So for the first time, we had a changeover in the deconstruction method to something called digestion. And digestion's wonderful because it includes the wonderful process of fermentation, which has been keeping humans breeding for about 7,000 years. Okay? Fermentation happens inside the body. It happens in a largely oxygen-free environment. And what comes out of a fermentation in the vat in the end is the opposite of inert. It is ert. The plus and minuses, this is supposed to be a minus, battling with this big broad pen a little bit, but never mind, the plus and minus. So your anions and cations are made available and easy to connect to by other plants and organisms to utilize. So it is now active and able to operate. So what started to happen in the ecological history is because of digestibility, the animal kingdom began to explode in numbers and activity. So as this occurred, you began to get a starvation of your decomposing organisms in the saprotrophs. They began to starve out. Okay. In the starvation process, part of my little story with evolution is that at this point, and there would have been a few trees that started this thing, everything happens a little bit, But somewhere in here was the process began of what they call the liquid carbon pathway, which fits on our list here as the liquid carbon pathway. That's Christine Jones's wording for it, various others. These are just basically sugars, simple, that flow out of the root systems and these feed organisms. And these then flow out into the soil again here to feed all these sort of bugs. And now for the first time, we had bacteria get a sniff of what it's like to live outside of the plant roots. And the bacteria then began to adapt, and some of them began to become ectophytes, which means they live outside the plant's root system. Today, there are now 26 or something of these we know about so far that are loose-living bacteria. It doesn't mean they live like your granny and grandpa did in the 60s. No, it just is they live loose in the soil where there's a lot of oxygen present, because suddenly with this happening, oxygen or air in the soil got massive. Of course, of oxygen, which is only 12% or something of the atmosphere is in there, at that level, there's 78% nitrogen present. So all of a sudden, those chaps could just get stuck and have a go and breed like hell, okay? So this now was a very different process. All these other organisms went through an adaptation phase, including our saprotroph fungi. They stopped decomposition. They went out of decomposition as a business. They had to do something different. Okay, the one we know of today is the mycorrhizal fungal network. They've got a couple of them and a couple of different names like vascular, arbustra, mycorrhizal fungi. Blah. This stuff is the same people living in the same pattern, but it's now invisible. So these ones here were all visible to the naked eye, and you will smell them as fungi. You'll recognize them because you've all smelled in the jock's cupboard or the back of the laundry cupboard in the house there. You've smelt that. That's what that smells like. These people at this end, if you dig them open, disturb them, they actually smell like rain. Okay? And this is now moved into the process of transportation nutrient, transportation of water, transportation of information. For the first time, we had some plants that could evolve to communicate underground rather than communicating above ground. Trees and 99% of forbs communicate above ground, passing messages by wind to each other, okay? That's not the kind of wind in the morning that we suffer from, different kind of wind. But anyway, outcome, that. So what we've now got was the first time we had the ability to long storage carbon in soils. Do I need to repeat that? The first time we had the ability to long storage carbon in soils, not in plant matter and not as labile or easily available carbon, not as in dark black color in soils, but as an invisible or near to invisible beer colored, if you like, bit of honey color. You spill the beer on the counter, you can see through it. It doesn't have the color in it anymore, which was going to be put away as a humic compound. What is the old humic compound? It's one of these. It's just not alive. Well, it's going to, they reckon, it's hexagonal in shape, has a carbon hanging off each end, except here it has another carbon and carries on in a helical format. So looked at from the side, it's a bit of a spring like this. It's made from necrosis. In other words, all these little buggers we're talking about that do the digestion process here. I'll draw them in here for you. If it's bacteria or fungi, the bacteria actually work their way around like a little Pac-Man, like work their way around a little bit of material. They ingest it and digest it inside the body. And if it's a single-cell fungi, when I first went to ag college, cattle ruminants were 100% bacteria. Now we know they got a whole lot of other stuff, but the bacterial portion is 50-50 bacteria and fungi. And these are single-cell fungi that operate in here. And if you look at them under a microscope, they have got wrinkly outsides, and they actually creep up on and work their way around a bit of material and ingest it before they break it down. So it's ingestion, and it's done inside an organism instead of outside. That's why it's so viable as availability, etc. But it's the death of these little people here in a process called necrosis, which then can lead to them being entombed. Like old Tutankhamun, when he shoveled off, they stuck him in a in a couple of 100,000 stones, and he was there when they dug him out 7,000 years later. Well, this is what happens with this humic compound. It's made out of fallen soldiers of this mob down here, and they get stuck together with the glues and glomalins, etc., and formed into this process. This is the key to soil and soil health. Each one of these sections operates like a little clay platelet. I'd left my hat down there, but I use that as an example of a clay platelet shape, that sort of like a saucer shape. There's lots of space for water, really can grab a lot of water, hold on to it, but being organic in its thing, in other words, made out of plant material, it can release that water as opposed to a clay hanging onto it and never giving it up type of thing. So your water holding capacity of one circuit of this is 3 times clay. Okay, but its ability to give it back is 100% better than clay, because clay will hold on to most of that water and not give it back to you. So this is the little key here, who has both the ability to trade in anions and cations, both pluses and minuses, and is able to give that backwards freely and able to keep soil apart and keep it together. And it was this process of this liquid carbon pathway that made this possible. Somewhere in the tail end of this was the breakthrough in the fibrous rooted mob to somebody called plantain. Anybody heard of plantain? It was once upon a time called ribgrass. It was the forefather of grass. Bananas, plantain, all those people, they were the forefathers of grass. That's a bit sexist. They four people of grass. How's that? They got going, and they were the ones who did a bit of like skew something behind the shed one night and came out with somebody who just totally dressed differently, and that was a grass. It comes out of the ground with a single leaf, a total anomaly in time. The oldest evidence of that's only 350 million years that we've found any evidence of it. So it's pretty recently evolved. In fact, they only really got on top of control of the earth in the last 70-odd million years. They're hugely responsible for the drop in carbon content in this time here. I've been writing that in this point here. Back here, it was 0.16% of the atmosphere, nearly 4 times what it is today. That's why dinosaurs could get so big, and you poor buggers are stuck with little Brahman cows about this big. It looked like a South Australian weather. Okay, 0.16% of the atmosphere. And this, there's other things that did that with carbon. Some of that stuck into oil, diamonds, blah, 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 stuck down there. But a whole lot of it went away into these deep soils we were talking about just now. So the grass plants with their fibrous roots here, all dealing with these sugar processes, feeding the bacteria and getting this ability not to desiccate, because they were taking carbon out of the atmosphere. They probably created the seasonality on Earth where you get dormant seasons. And by golly, they're the thing that can help us handle that. Without grass, you've got no ability to carrying capacity forward, because forbs desiccate when it gets dry. Look, there's a couple that don't desiccate too badly, but anybody here ever had a lucerne crop? Well, it gets really hot in the afternoon, 45 degrees, 3 days in a row, all the leaves have fallen off the bastard, right? And carrying capacity forward, beautiful nutrition, not much in the way of carrying capacity. You've got grasses in between it, they'll carry it forward. But the grasses have had a tough time over time, because their root systems, although they can get down to 6 or 8 meters in places, the grasses tend to be a relatively shallow compared to the deep root of this. Although its feeding roots are much deeper down than that old system, they've always had a problem with water through the dormant season. So the mycorrhizal fungal network has got to be there to feed water around to keep them going through that time. Okay? But these are the things that carried it forward, and they are probably responsible for this drop in carbon content, besides what is still stuck in coal, etc., to bring it to today. The animal kingdom just got mad-sized on this mycorrhizal fungal network. This is the main jobby to turn carbon over, and has, in where you've got true grasslands, which are always got to be mixed with some herbs, there are always going to be some in there, especially where it's being well utilized, is turned into dung and urine at a very high percent. 90% of what is grazed is going to be turned into dung and urine. Okay? When the, what do you call them, the people who came around Australia and discovered Australia, and they were the first people here. Get out of the way, you bastard. Stand out of the way of the camera. Take a picture. Then they're the first humans here. They defined most of Australia, where even though they looked like grassy country, there were these big gentleman's park trees far apart. They called them open woodland. Why? Because their training in Western Europe, if you were bogging a horse in it, if it smelt of fungi, even Robin Hood didn't sleep on the ground, your cousin, he slept up in the tree because he didn't want to lie on the ground because he was scared of the fungi, the night ills they called them, right? They wanted to sleep up in the trees. That is a woodland, and that's why it was called a woodland. North American prairies, grasslands. The horses' hooves rang on the prairie. Okay, one colour of soil, no different topsoil colour, one colour, going down 3, 4, 5 metres. How did Albiel know he was getting attacked by a group of Apache or Cheyenne, whoever they were? Because he heard their horses' hooves ringing on the prairie on their attack, so they were able to fight them off. Prairies, the Southern African half veld, straight almost grassland. The veld around that, the low veld, the thorn veld. There are places there where Livingstone and Stanley that went to the same damn style of education that Leichhardt, Mitchell, Hume, etc. went to. They weren't first cousins, but they all had the same bloody church school. This is how a thing works in succession training. They called places where you had to crawl between the trees savanna grasslands. Why did they call them grassland savannas? Because the soil smelt like rain. The soil had intrinsic ability to hold itself together, and the horses stayed on top of it. They were not sinking down like this. And nobody can actually argue that fact, because Livingstone walked through country that he called woodlands. The Dulgu forest, he called it a forest. Okay, most forests were wet. The woodlands were dry. Okay, the teak forests of northern Rhodesia were called forests because they were forest systems. The sand forests of northern Zululand were called forests because of that, of the fact that they had all that detritus at soil surface and they smelled at fungi. So the Australian scenario had a woodland scenario. It was kept woodland by very careful burning. It was a grazing ecosystem that's well enough documented that nobody can really chew up too much of that. 13 genera of species over 40 kilos in size disappeared. Genera, think about it, sheep and goats are the same genera, so it's both sheep and goats when they're talking that. If you think about bovines, it's eland, wildebeest, buffalo, and cattle, all disappearing, oryx, etc., musk oxen, all disappearing, okay? So that is a pretty big evidence of a loss of grazing organism. Turning that basically into a woodland scenario, very cleverly and astutely managed with fire, cool fire, so that the litter layer at soil surface didn't burn off, and that is why it was a woodland, even though it was waving in grass at the time. Okay, because the operational system of it was a woodland. So that's Australian history tacked in on the end of that. This is the ecological history over time. The key point I'm wanting you to take home out of this first session is that a woodland ecosystem operates top down. A lot of you have been to schools that tell you put lots of litter on the soil surface, lots of litter on the soil surface. And that is a form, can I just spin this chappy around here again? That is the form that you've gone and chosen. I'll write my little goal. Oh, this is what it looks like. It's going to be a covered soil and deep litter layer, and that's what's going to be the outcome. Well, guess what? You've just completely rooted your opportunities of driving a grazing, functioning ecosystem, because that is not how it operates. So the rest of your life, you'll be pushing shit uphill with woody weeds, scrub encroachment, etc. Will you get a change to start with if you go from set stocking to cell grazing? Hell yeah. You've made a massive change. The cell grazing or holistic grazing process will tighten the plant spacing. It'll all take off. It'll get covered. The water cycle will improve. Everybody can be out with their big, does that say 15? I thought it would say 5, right? It's another 15. Can we start and just push it into low ratio for a minute? Take my time a bit. Good, thank you very much. So that change is immense. Does the ecosystem change? Oh, absolutely. From very little grazing of low stock numbers, hanging around water points on a set stock thing, not trekking out to the back, well, moving those animals around would make a difference. The problem with it, of course, and these are Savory's words, not mine, as an impression of most holistic management and most cell graziers, is that all they actually do is move rest around the environment, okay? And it's worsened by rotational grazing, as I'll say just now. He missed that point in Andre Voisin's work, but I'll do that on a new picture later on, okay? We'll go and define the difference between rotational grazing, which includes cell and holistic grazing, and rational grazing, which is Andre Voisin's original method of doing it, plus Venter-Driever's. And Andre Voisin is seen as being the forefather of cell and holistic grazing. Well, I don't know who translated it even from the English part, which was translated from French, because it doesn't look anything like the same. Okay, but anyway, point being, you get a change. Now, after that, if you're moving stock around and you're moving rest around the landscape, Alan Savory, what he should be given huge amount of recognition for, and I hope every one of you who've read his books, is the recognition that where there's not humidity all the time, decomposition even stops. So Dick's whole thing about decomposition here is going on and on and on about decomposition. Geez, 3/4 of Australia, your decomposition is down to in places only 2 days a year. All up the west coast of southern Africa, where the average rainfall is less than 5 mils per year, decomposition ain't going to happen. If 15 mil average rainfall properties there, 6,000 hectares each that run sheep, those chaps don't get decomposition. It's a thing that doesn't happen. It's digestion, which is the way it was run in those days, and of course, the one that I haven't got on our deconstruction of carbon particles here, which is our, I'll use black for it, is oxidation. Any greens in the room? That's lucky. Nobody who's going to say we're not allowed to, burn these forests to get rid of some of the massive fuel load, I think is what they say. So oxidation, there's 2 routes of oxidation. The one is pretty quick, and it's very well known in Australia. It's National Parliament's favourite thing, like getting lots of people burnt, heaps of poor little children roasted, and then they blame it on the environment when it was the people who didn't get rid of the plant material in the first place. That's called fire. That is fast oxidation, okay? If you don't turn it around, this built up, constructed carbon material, it's going to fucking turn around in another way. That's all the choices it's got. So it will burn if it's not going to decompose. And the only place that it decomposes all year round in Australia, I don't even know where that is, because our rainforests, maybe in the Daintree, the rest of what we call rainforests in Australia are actually seasonally wet forests. By the time you go there in November, if you go to Yungabara or somewhere and you walk in the forest, there's little layer this big. All that rainforest that burned a couple of years ago, not far from here, guess what? That was little layer. That's not a rainforest, it's a rare end. That is an occasional wet forest. In the meantime, the plant material's got to stand there. Okay, it will get burnt and it will turn back into carbon again, and everything will smile and use it, except us poor buggers who've lost homes and people and all the rest of it in the destruction of our communities, okay? So the quick burning is a problem. Now, quickly on this one, decomposition, byproduct, broken down carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, blah, 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 and this is a different color. You'll notice I'm writing this one in red and in really big letters here. Anybody ever heard of methane? I'm sure the press is not here today. Methane is the byproduct of this process. The byproduct of digestion process. I bet you this morning there are a few fellas in bed with the blankets got leveled out for a few seconds. Methane, byproduct. Liquid carbon pathway, it's fed to these little bugs like this. You know what they do when they've got a good meal? They get a bit of leg over and then they let a bit of methane out, right? So there they go. Average lifespan of these people, 4 hours. Birth, burping a bit of methane, get a leg over, death, etc. The oxidation pathway, when it comes out of a quick oxidation process and ends up in smoke in the atmosphere, byproduct, methane. But this is a real bastard because it's mixed with bromide. So it's actually called methyl bromide. And this is the bastard who makes the holes in the ozone layer. So after those big fires, just 16, I think it was, it burned half of the southern parts of Australia, the ozone hole just went extra bigger by, I think it was nearly 20%. Okay, so this is a real bastard. It is totally irresponsible to think that you are going to have a healthy Australia by burning back to 70% of Australia or 60% or 30% every year. That is irresponsible. This is destructive to the ozone layer. This has got a lifespan, an average of about 4 hours in the atmosphere. Okay, especially if it's with grazing animals, that has got a direct link back to grasses where they can use that methane almost immediately, pick it up and use it and go again in its own little hothouse scenario. Right, we have a slow oxidation process, which most of you here would know about. My little page is getting a bit overloaded here, I reckon. This slow oxidation is when plant matter out in the paddock there goes grey and silver and stands there and doesn't break down. That's slow oxidation. And that's what Savory was recognising as being totally destructive to our grazing ecosystems. And we need to realise that that's the case because slow oxidation tends to lead us all the way back to the lichen ecosystems over here, which was long time ago, before elephant got trunks from Mr. Crocodile, okay? Long time ago. Right, so why have I gone back through all of this? I want you guys to be able to deal with basic principle. I want you to be able to look at what's happening in your country. I want you to be able to smell it, and I want you to be able to see that ecosystem in operation in your country. Then, when somebody comes and tells you that this will work or that's work, or get all your litter, get your cattle all in one little mob, one mother of a mob close together and trample all this plant material this thick to the soil, that is fucking stupid. Why? Because all that litter ends up at soil surface, driving a woodland ecosystem. No animals on earth graze at high densities. They camp at high densities, they deal with predators at high densities. When they're grazing, they spread out. They don't graze under each other's asses. And you can go and look at mobs that are driven at really high densities, 2,000 or 3,000 head per hectare, and you'll never find one with the gut full. You bugger up their room and graze pressure, etc., and you put all this on the ground. Then, in Gippsland, I was on a people's place, a drought. Gippsland probably means it hasn't rained for about 3 days. I think it was something like 3 weeks, okay, it hadn't rained, but they get this lovely rain that night, 30 mils, everybody big smiles, zips are down, they're excited about having all this rain. We go to the paddock, they've got a litter layer like this at soil surface, 36 mils, soil's dry. They're not stupid. They've just been taught this shit, you know. Your grandparents, to get dry in the old days, what did they do? They got grass, stacked it like litter, and put it on the roof of a couple of pieces of wood, and it kept the rain out of their huts, okay? That's called thatch. That's what happens in that situation. You lose too much moisture. Now, Dick is not a proponent of bare ground. Savory's words, overgrazing tightens plant spacings. We might get into a little bit of how we tighten the plant spacings in the second run. We tighten plant spacing. You cannot graze paddocks without having some organic matter left over, falling onto the soil surface. You will have a covered soil where you can. I know that I've got guys out in the Darling that have only got 3 kilos of dry matter per hectare grazable. It was very difficult to cover a soil with that. I don't care what you do, but anyway, so we're going to have some bare ground around, but that's in areas where the rainfall is really erratic and low and long-term like that. Okay, so if you can follow on this, the thinking behind this, the actual details of how these ecosystems operate. If you can drive a grazing ecosystem, you will end up with a covered soil with tighter plant spacing, and if that grazing methodology, which we'll get to later on, includes a good whack of diversity in how it's practiced, biodiversity will come out as an outcome at the other end. You cannot get biodiverse outcomes with simple, repeated processes. Okay? That's why I've taken you back to principles, and I've taken you back through this story here. I have hopefully given recognition to the people. You can come up, Wentz, we're good to go. To the people whose stuff that I've learned off. In this, Christine Jones, been a big part of my learning, Dr. Christine Jones. Walter Yaney, the old mad professor from down there, Canberra way. There's a hell of a lot of people that I'm really grateful to, including Alan Savory and that mob. Thank you very much. Wendy.
Thank you so much, Dick. That was mind-boggling and also highly entertaining. I could have used the long black dick now, but to be fair to me,
she's a pussy. When
someone sends you an email and says, you can call me long black dick, what?
She was looking for something to start the process.
Yeah, well, it was nice, different, unusual, as Kath and Kim would say. I couldn't use it, but now it's contextual, quite funny. Okay, who's got a question for Dick?
Pop your hand
up. We've got
up
a roving mic.
Wait till I get to you.
I'll just keep this thing loose. Anybody can take pictures of that if they want. Sharon.
Dick, now say we've got fungus, that undesirable fungus on the ground. We've got a beast eating nearby. Will that beast move away from the smell of that fungus and go and graze somewhere else?
Absolutely. The main reason it move away is probably not from the fungal smell, but it'll move away from utilising that plant because the sugar content of that plant will be really, really low. Once the acidic processes are in place, so if the decomposers are operating there, to make the plant less able to produce sugars, I dig plants open, as you know, and look for sugar flow out of the root system. Christine Jones simply measures bricks, and if the bricks level is high, the plant will be producing sugars to go into the soil. And some of the details of how or when they do it, we'll do later on. But absolutely put them off. South Australia, mallee, lines of mallee left through the country. Mallee's a very anti-grazing ecosystem plant, really ancient one. And some eucalypts, especially the box trees, do fit in really well into a grazing ecosystem, but most of the true eucalypts don't. Anyway, you get trees that do. Mallee doesn't, and you'll have a strip through there in the middle of January. There's a little green grass here or there underneath the mallee, and there's a mob of 3,000 wethers in that paddock. They eat dry wheat straw in the paddock. They won't eat that green plant. Next.
Thank you. Dick, a couple of things. You mentioned sheep in South Australia. Well, I reckon northern South Australia has the biggest merino sheep you'll find. The next one was you talked about lucerne and why it spills all its foliage after a couple of weeks of bloody dry weather. It has the deepest taproot you'll come across. Having been involved in lucerne 40 years ago, do you not think that a lot of that loss is through, especially in cutting lucerne more so than grazing, but lack of cover on the ground?
Yeah, look, that will be, the plant's under stress. That's why it's doing that. It's got this factory, then it can't stop itself running water out of its leaves, and that's the way to do it, Mark. So, yeah, probably is. But, quite often that doesn't occur until there's a rain, and actually the soil's a bit wet, and then it cooks the soil, makes a little bit of a boiling, if you like, of it, and that's actually what causes it more frequently than the straight dry scenario. Half blanches them and the leaves come off it. So can we go to Viraj next? He's been standing very politely there waiting for a question.
First of all, thank you very much, Dick, for having a nice trip to rhizosphere, root zone. You're talking about saprotop, is any specific species of that fungi for that saprotop?
The species of these guys?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm afraid I don't know their names. I only barely made it through school, Viraj. I never went to uni. And the main reason for that, because I was terrified I could never remember any. My sister's 4 years younger than me. She taught me the alphabet. So I've always been a bit of a hard bastard to teach it. So I'm afraid names I can't remember, which is why I only ever remember one name here and one name there. I'm afraid I can't remember the names of these people. That one I've got one of these bacteria, the only one I can remember, so I'll show off for a second, is the Zygobacter mob, but I think there's 26 of these. I don't know. Would you know any to share?
No, I'm just thinking might be, like trichoderma or any other, like...
Yeah, I've heard of that one. I think that's part of the show.
Yeah. No,
Yep.
Yeah. No, all good. Thank you.
Super.
Thank you.
Thank
Who
you.
else? Is there another question? No? Is there anyone else?
We've got
Down
a
the
question
front
up
here?
at the front here, keeping
Who's that?
Gilly fit here.
Hello.
Oh, just give it to you so everybody's got an idea.
Hey Dick, just for that last comment you were saying there about crash grazing not being a great thing, that Gabe Brown, you would have dealt with his books and stuff, that's a big strategy for him the way I understand it. Am I wrong in understanding what he's saying or wrong in understanding what you're saying about crash grazing and soil armouring and all of those things that he promotes?
I don't think I've got the name of the person you were talking about, first of all.
Gabe Brown, he's written
Oh, Gabe Brown.
some books, yeah.
Yeah, fucking Americans.
Gabe,
Gabe,
he's up in the snow.
he's beautiful, Gabe. Look, they get away with all sorts of shit there because they're living in, as they tell you, all Americans will tell you, that's God's country. That's where he first, made the land of milk and honey and stuff. Those guys are living on a basalt soil. Most of them, it came out from straight underneath the ice, straight under the belly of animals. It has got no experience of this at all. It's like the half-veld in South Africa. I grew up in the mountains. We had springs to feed water to the house. One of those was fenced off when I was a little bugger. 30 years later, it still had not grown a tree or a shrub in it. It's got no idea how to do that. It's got no idea how to go decomposition because 40,000 years ago under the Dwaka Ice Age, it came out straight under the belly of an animal. So look, those guys get away with it, but Gabe Brown is quite interesting because he's no longer moving his fences 15 times a day. He's moving his animals 3 days, 4 days now. Why? Because it improves the animal performance to such an extent. The density thing, your crash grazing, whatever terminology you want to use it, an animal grazes for 4 hours, ruminates for 8 as an average. Depending on the rate of passage, down to 2 hours grazing, 4 hours rumination. If you keep moving that animal all those times through the day, you break down its timing and its capability to do the rumination versus the graze. And those animals begin to lose condition because of their digestion, A, and B, their ability to select. Those guys are in pretty simple scenarios. It's really easy for them. Anything can select anything at once. Where they've planted all these multi-species stuff, those are actually like monocultures. I'll say that again. The multi-species that they've planted are monocultures because every single plant is the same age on a pre-prepared soil which has got the same qualities throughout it. Does that make sense? The animals will select liberally rather than select individually. We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with wild grazing where this plant is standing on a rock, that plant's in a soft, easy place, that one there's got broad leaves and that one's got thin leaves and they're the same species because something dung there previously to make it work. So the animals need to select their diet. The moment we put them at too high a density, selection drops down and we move away from it. You can get them as high as you like in density. I don't have a problem with that too much as long as your grazing pressure is relatively high in Australia where the country knows how to do this. This is its intrinsic go-to status. It doesn't forget it's only 200 years since it was a forest in many areas, open woodland, let's call it, sorry. And that's what it's going to want to drop back to. So as soon as you put too much litter on that country, you'll slip into the wrong box. In Southern Africa, Gabe Brown and them have that as an opportunity. They can put litter down at soil surface. If it's summer rainfall country, it'll turn on as soon as the soil temperature goes over 12. If it's winter rainfall, it'll be when it goes below 10. And you get your first moisture of the season. Those bugs will be work ready. And you've got litter lying at soil surface. 3 days later, it smells of rain and the soil surface is bare. That's what would happen at Gabe's. So even if he's got that cover on it, 3 days later, it's gone. Unless it was too thick. So in his case, not too much of a problem. Yeah, he gets away with it and they then tell the rest of the world how to do it. Got these lovely things there. Sorry to have a dig at the Americans again, but they're not the brightest humans on earth. They have this scenario, for example, where they talk about leaving so much material everywhere and the bars and all walked and the tart, and then the guy sits there and he shows you the picture behind him while he's giving you a blue movie there, what they call it, a YouTube movie, and they talk about all these animals that are high dense. So you have a look at them, all of their heads are up in the air. And I don't see them browsing trees at the time. Animal with its head up in the air that's a grazing animal is not fucking grazing. I don't care what you think, it's not grazing. It is walking, walking. And then they take that picture away and they replace it with one of the wildebeest on a migration, little mobs of 80 wildebeest, all with their heads up grazing. No, they're migrating, okay? That's bullshit that they're grazing. You go and try and find pictures of grazing bison. You can find them. There's a bison here. There's a bison where Mr. Big Hat is. There's a bison there where Pretty Lady is there. There's a bison where Big Chris Wendelborn is. They're that far apart to graze. They're not grazing when they're in those big mobs. They've got a whole train load of fucking Yankee Doodles with big guns shooting them at the time, and that's why in that big density. Thanks for the question. Next.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Where am I?
And by the way, all those pictures that you see of those bison and all those pioneers, you can see the nails in the horse's hooves. There's no grass taller than that. And there's big paunchy fellas with big beards like Chris's. There's a question down there, so long, Gilly. And big paunchies and all the animals hanging off and all the blokes who've done the skinning work. Get out of the way, you bastards, where you want to look like we've done it all. And they sit there in front of the wagons and, mate, you can see the soles of their boots, even South Australian boots like mine, because it's grazed short. Righto, your question.
Is it only moisture, or is there certain soil conditions that help with the decomposition?
Both. You've got to be moisture present for decomposition to take place in any case, but there would certainly be soil conditions that would make that easier to happen. In the same with digestion process and this process of the liquid carbon pathway, really easy to instigate and get to happen in sandy soils. It's a hell of a job on those big, heavy black soils where there's no air in the soil. So that makes a huge difference where it is. And yet you dig open those big black soils, the ones that are what they call them self-mulching, and they've like swallowed half of the plant material up at the top and then have gone and stretched and shut it up again. You'll find those white saprotrophs invariably nearly under country like that because it's been ingesting all this plant material. Cool.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yep, we got one down here. Jason, I believe the young man's name is. Yeah. The Cape Horn salesman, him and Magellan.
Yeah, Dick, that's correct. Hey, my question around, is there a place ever for intervention? I'm talking mechanical intervention, I'm talking herbicide intervention. I think you mentioned you like Christine Jones. I'm pretty certain I read something one stage where she talks about, don't go crazy, just tickle the country a bit. Just steady, tickle. And yeah, because I think, you know, my example there, it's a coastal tea tree country. The soil gets anaerobic in the wet season, sets hard like concrete, you know. Is there a place to say, all right, this is the problem I've got. I can, as a one-off thing or whatever, I can go in there and do a bit of deep ripping. Or what's your thoughts on that?
I'm a great believer in doing what's appropriate for your bit of country, Jason. I've been all over Australia. I mean, I'm on the road 200 days a year or whatever. And there's a hell of a lot of businesses built on some really expensive country that go out there and try and take it on with all the little sweetie things all in place, and they're only going to do it with animals and whatever. And 15 years later, $8,000 an acre country has got production off it at about 0.1 return on what the country's worth. Mate, if you've got expensive country, I don't think you've got any choice but to go and not just tickle it. If you want change, don't go there and fiddle around with a little this and that. You know, get stuck into it and make a reasonable change to it. But the key thing for me on change is you've got to change the value of the thing. You've got to change it up. If you're changing it down, you're not really achieving anything. So what do we want to do if we're wanting to change up? If we want to change country up, Well, if it's a grazing ecosystem you're running, not a cropping ecosystem, so I'll give space for the fact that somebody might be a canola operator or a radish producer, that's going to be a totally different setup over here, right? But if it's a grazing ecosystem you're trying to operate around, you've got to try and work within this ecosystem and try and set it up for you. You want fibrous root systems. You want lots of these higher order forms in amongst it, like just the standard, of course, chicory, plantain, lucerne, 3 different families there. Grass is all only 1 family, that's 4. Let a few weeds come into it. Yes, you can let weeds get into your paddock and be useful. That'll get you up to 8 families, no problem at all, huge diversity. You want the roots to get into that rip line of yours as quickly as possible so that it remains yours. It doesn't just filter down. All that fine stuff in the tea tree country will be fines and it'll get down in there and pack it harder than it was before. You don't want that to happen, so you can make that happen. So I'll underline what Jason said by saying the following statement. The cheapest fertilizer any one of you can put on your country is air. So ripping it will let air into it. That'll rejuvenate the whole show down there. You let air in, then grasses can suddenly fix all the nitrogen and do all this job. The legumes just shut down. The nodules will be there. None of them will be working until the grasses become reproductive and stop producing nitrogen. Then the legumes will kick in and start doing it. So the more biodiversity you can put in, the more effort you can in there to disturb it, the quicker you're going to get there. But it's the management around that obviously give you the highest return on it.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. That's a great answer because, you know, I had a theory, Dick. I had a theory about I need aeration. Dung beetles, right? Dung beetles are perfect for it. So stop using all the things that damage dung beetles. Give them the best conditions that I can give them to thrive and prosper. And happy days, I'm seeing dung beetles. But I'm not sure where you're from, Dick. Do you have cane toads where you are?
In South Australia, the buggers wouldn't survive, no.
No, they don't. Well, they survive good here. And they've got a favourite habit, Dick. They sit on top of a cow pat and gorge themselves with dung beetles. So I haven't come up with a holistic way to control that yet. But
you don't have to do anything about that, Jason.
Yeah.
How many cane toads do you see out feeding in the daytime?
Yeah, true story. True story.
So, old mate, a very famous bloke actually, passed on now. His name was Argo Rust. He was one of those Germans. I did a lot of work in Namibia. So Namibia is a German colony. Well, these buggers natter away in German. I was very confused when they were telling me that they verkauft their cows. I was quite interested in that. That means sold. Okay, so anyway, in this scenario like that, there's always a bit of a challenge, you know. Anyway, so old Argo started introducing chickens because obviously that Joel Salatin's news somehow had filtered in there. And so he put chickens in amongst his cattle and he was very excited about it. Then his next thing, my dung beetles is klar. They're all gone. This is fuck up. He didn't fuck off them, but that's what I asked him. Did he fuck off them? He said no. Anyway, he just said, I said to him, go and have a look tonight. Went there with a torch. Dung beetles flat out at night. They just realised chickens go to bed at night, they'll be at work. So, you know, that's not the first thing in nature that'll go and eat those things. I went for a lovely walk this morning. There was a little bit of dung on the side of the roads. I don't know if a dog had shat there or whatever on the side of that track. Went down past the wetland thing. And the bush turkeys had been in there and they dug out all the insects that were in there. So that's bird life. That's how it operates, you know. So like, I guess if you ended up with too much bird life, the dung beetles just have to be quick or dinner. And it's all part of the whole show, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for another probably 2 questions.
I think I've terrified everyone clearly into silence. No other questions? Yeah, we got one at the front here.
Thanks for your presentation, really nice, I like it. And so, I have a doubt regarding, so what Xavier has been saying also here in Australia, Charles Mass as well, in terms of a bit of this they call the eco-literacy. So
yes.
They consider that the lack of eco-literacy makes it difficult for us to improve management or to create the condition for the nature work for us in the system. So the first question, how do you think this lack of eco-literacy really impacts in terms of this transition in the holistic management? And also, what do you think, because we know that to create these conditions through management, it's not exactly that simple, depend of the ecosystem. Like they have this struggle for years in the Patagonia. I went to Patagonia to work with Pablo Morelli a little bit, so I know a little bit of the holistic management. And what do you think, in your opinion, are these big challenges to create these conditions through management? And why the farmers, a lot of them, they don't adopt and think it's difficult to adopt a new management that can create these conditions through nature?
Yeah.
Easy question.
Why it's difficult to adopt? Well, first and foremost, I think that everybody's on their own travel route, aren't they? And the big thing about teaching people stuff or carrying information across is that that's information or knowledge. Okay, that's the first thing. But, you know, you can have all the knowledge in the world, and you've seen them arrive there from the bank probably in some tight moleskin-looking pants, and flash RMs arrive at your place, and obviously got degrees coming out of their ears, but when you get them to the gate, they don't know how to open the frickin' thing, right? So there is...
Except for our CBA friends here, they do.
Oh,
know how to open the gate.
CBA, we've got them covered, righto. CB always stands for Clever Bugger, where I come from. Association of Clever Buggers. So knowledge is one thing, but then there is the practical experience and the try, monkey do, monkey try, monkey fail, monkey try something different things, and that evolves eventually into wisdom. So somebody like me, who was trained in holistic management, got really overexcited about it. I thought I was the best holistic grazing example in the world. I probably was at that stage in terms of measuring holistic management. I trained educators all over the world for them. In the US too, they used to take me over there to do the ecological side of it. They didn't let me loose among the Americans too much with anything social, because I used to upset them, of course. But anyway, the point is that there are very few people who are able to complete that process of doing something, assessing the outcome of it, and are very happy to change what they do. And inside holistic management, you've got exactly the same problem. We've got, these are the way that it must look, this is how the outcome is, this is how the ecosystem works, and new knowledge is completely pushed away. And if you go and start doing that practices, your role actually is to do it, try a little this, try a little that, learn what works and what changes, and begin to adapt your own thing. I didn't just stumble on the grazing naturally method. It took me years of first cell grazing, first olden day moving stock around. South Africa, set stocking was banned in the early 1970s. Okay, so if you want to know anything about moving stock around, talk to South Africans. They've been doing it for a long time. Okay, there were some problems with it as well, like, for example, this is what's going to happen here. There was a massive control from the government on stock numbers. You cannot have both ecological improvement and moving animals around without increased stock numbers, because everything goes backwards if you don't. Right, so anyway, you start doing this stuff, and we did more of it, and we were able to observe that something wasn't working right. Aussies in general are actually very good observers, but in the land but most of them have no time to spend with that observation to turn it into further investigation, which will again lead to observation, which eventually might lead to monkey doing something different. Does that make sense? And I think that this is the big challenge all over the world. It's the practice of it. So the people who are out there preaching it are often not the people that are actually doing it. And this is where the complication comes in. When I was a little bugger, I think I was about 4, probably the first time I remember doing it, standing on the seat of the Land Rover, driving to town with the old man. He's been called up by the soil conservation people who used to monitor the stock numbers, how you graze them, the movement, etc. And he's burnt some country too early, and he's been called up in front of the Soil Conservation Committee, and he's obviously hell of uptight, and he's you know, we're on the way there. Eventually says to me, "Hey boy, Do you know that I've got to go and stand to it and talk to a whole group of experts today? Yeah, Dad, I've heard the story before, so I know it's easy. Do you know what an expert is? No, Dad, of course I don't, because you can't tell him. Well, an expert is a bloke who's going to stand up there and he's going to lecture me about sex for 4 hours, and at the end of it I'll discover he hasn't met a woman yet. So this is the reality of this particular enterprise, is that so often the people that are talking about doing it aren't actually doing it, and or are only doing it to achieve some predetermined outcome, which they're measuring that outcome by. There's all dead grass. It looks like this. That I better not mention the organisation, but there's an organisation who do massive studies of people who grass hoarders and have all this feed dead on their places and think that they're doing a really good job. And if you're doing that, well, then you've ticked your box and you think you've arrived. It's the whole ecosystem that matters. And I think that link between doing and observing what's happening in the whole ecosystem with the economics, the ecology, the animals, they're all part of it. That's what's missing to get it to go into more practice more easily. Does that make sense? Yeah. But at the same time, I'm not worried about it. I couldn't give a rat's backside. It's going to take forever. You know why? Because before you know it, everybody's doing something anyway. Everybody's learning. Like, all this stuff now about regenerative ag, and everybody's leaping around and either, don't talk. There's probably chaps here who work for elders or for some CRT or something in selling poisons and selling things like that. And everybody, these are bad bastards. They're selling all this poison, all this. It's bullshit. Those guys are changing quicker than you know. The things are changing all over the world. And what's beautiful about it is that it's changing in very loose directions, a bit like a fire being driven by a loose, what do we call it, a witching wind. It doesn't know which way it wants to go, And I think that's great, because in the end, there's multiple ways of doing a thing, and we can come out at the other end with just deeper knowledge and various ways of doing things. There's no such thing as a right way. So hopefully I've helped a little bit there. It's not the age of the people present. It's not the level of education of the people present. It's the level of presence of the people present.